The silence was the first thing that struck Elara Vance. It wasn't the gentle, comforting quiet of her downtown apartment, muffled by the distant hum of traffic and the soft whir of central air. This was a profound, almost aggressive silence, broken only by the sigh of wind through ancient pines and the occasional, startling crack of a branch from deep within the woods. It was the sound of absolute solitude, and for the first time in 3 miserable, blank-page months, Elara felt a flicker of something other than panic. It felt like possibility. She stood on the creaking porch of the A-frame cabin, keys cold in her hand, and breathed in the sharp, pine-scented air of the Colorado Rockies. Whispering Pines Retreat, the listing had called it, and the photos had shown a charming, isolated haven perfect for a writer seeking inspiration. It was perfect. It had to be. Her publisher, Brenda, had been patient, but the emails were becoming increasingly laced with a frantic politeness that Elara knew was the prelude to a full-blown crisis. Just checking in on progress, darling. The market is simply yearning for another Elara Vance epic. Any pages yet? There were no pages. There was only the block. A great, woolly, suffocating wall that had descended upon her imagination the moment her last book, A Heart's Unyielding Compass, had hit #1 on the New York Times list. The words that had once flowed like a river had dried up into a barren creek bed. Her characters, usually so vivid and demanding in her mind, had fallen silent. She couldn't write a kiss without cringing, couldn't plot a meet-cute without a cynical voice in her head whispering, as if this cabin, rented for a month under an assumed name, was her Hail Mary. No internet, no distractions, no well-meaning friends checking in. Just her laptop, and the daunting task of rediscovering the magic that had made her the reigning queen of contemporary romance. The inside of the cabin was exactly as advertised, rustic but comfortable, with a large stone fireplace, a deep leather armchair, and a sturdy oak desk positioned before a window that looked out onto a breathtaking vista of snow-dusted peaks. Elara unpacked her few belongings with a sense of ritual, placing her lucky typewriter-shaped mug on the desk, arranging her favorite pens, and finally, with a deep breath, opening her laptop. The blank white screen glowed in the dimming afternoon light, a pristine challenge. She typed a single sentence, Chapter 1. The cursor blinked, and blinked, and blinked. An hour later, the sentence remained alone, a tiny, lonely island in a sea of white. The silence, once promising, now felt heavy, accusatory. She got up, paced the length of the small living area, and made herself a cup of tea she didn't want. This was ridiculous. She had written 23 novels. She knew how to do this. She just needed to start, to find the spark. Frustrated, she decided to explore. The cabin was a duplex, the listing had mentioned, but assured total privacy with separate entrances and soundproofing. Her side was the west wing. She peered out her front window and saw the other front door, about 20 feet away, partially obscured by a large, overgrown blue spruce. There was a dark pickup truck parked nearby, dusted with road grime. So she had a neighbor, hopefully a quiet one. Back inside, she settled into the armchair, pulling a soft blanket over her legs, and tried to conjure her hero. Grayson, a rugged, emotionally unavailable architect with a hidden heart of gold. She closed her eyes, trying to picture him. But instead of a chiseled jaw and brooding eyes, all she could see was the blinking cursor. And then, a sound pierced the silence. Not a natural sound, a human sound. It was music, but not just any music. It was the aggressive, snarling blast of 1980s thrash metal, a furious torrent of distorted guitars and screaming vocals that vibrated through the log walls as if they were paper. Elara shot upright, the blanket falling to the floor. The noise was coming from the shared wall. So much for soundproofing. It was so loud she could feel the bass thrumming in her teeth. This was not part of the plan. This was the anti-plan. She waited 5 minutes, then 10, her irritation mounting with each crashing cymbal. This was her sanctuary, her last chance. She couldn't work with this audio assault going on. Steeling herself, She marched out her front door, the cold air biting through her thin sweater, and stomped over to the neighbor's porch. She rapped sharply on the door. The music cut off mid-scream. The door swung open, and Elara found herself facing a man who was the physical embodiment of the music he'd been playing. He was tall and lean, dressed in a faded black t-shirt and jeans, his dark hair a bit too long and unruly. He had the shadow of a beard on a sharply defined jaw, and his eyes were the color of a winter storm, a cool, assessing gray. He held a chiseled mahogany bookmark in one hand, as if he'd just slammed it shut in a book. Yes. His voice was a low baritone, devoid of warmth or apology. Elara, momentarily thrown by his direct, unsmiling gaze, gathered her composure. I'm your new neighbor, Elara. She decided against using her pen name, Lacey Lovelace. I just moved in, and, well, the music was a bit loud. The walls aren't as thick as I'd hoped. He didn't smile, didn't look contrite. He simply looked her up and down, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second on the fluffy pink socks she'd forgotten she was wearing. Noted, he said flatly.
I'm Cassian.
I was editing. Editing? She repeated, incredulous. To that. A different kind of muse, he said, a ghost of a smirk touching his lips. His eyes drifted past her, toward her cabin's front door. Let me guess. You're a writer. Elara blinked. How did you know? City pallor, a desperate look in your eyes, and you showed up here in the off-season. It's either a writer or a fugitive. You don't look like a fugitive. He leaned against the door jamb. What do you write? She straightened her spine, a defensive gesture she'd perfected in 1,000 interviews. Romance. The word hung in the cold air between them. Cassian's smirk widened into a full, though decidedly cynical, smile. Ah, he said, the single syllable dripping with condescension. The grand passions, the faded love, the happily ever afters. Elara felt her cheeks grow warm. People seem to like them. I'm sure they do. Pleasant escape from reality. I write mysteries, the kind where people are murdered for realistic, often petty, reasons, and the killer is rarely brought to justice by a dashing duke with a troubled past. He tapped the bookmark against his leg. I deal in the truth of human nature, the greed, the malice, the lies. The cheerful one, then. Elara shot back, her temper fraying. We can't all trade in unrealistic fantasies, Ms. Elara. He pushed himself off the door jamb. I'll keep the music down. Try not to have any overly dramatic epiphanies on your side of the wall. The acoustics are terrible. And with that, he closed the door, leaving her standing on his porch, fuming in the frigid mountain air. Unrealistic fantasies? How dare he? She trudged back to her cabin, slamming the door harder than necessary. The silence had returned, but it was different now. It was charged, polluted by the encounter. She glared at her laptop, at the lone chapter 1. The cursor seemed to be mocking her. Unrealistic fantasies. With a surge of defiant energy, she sat down and began to type, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She wrote a scene where her heroine, a plucky bookstore owner, confronted a rude, arrogant, and infuriatingly handsome businessman at a charity gala. She gave the heroine all the cutting, witty retorts Elara wished she'd thought of on Cassian's porch. She poured all her frustration and indignation into the words, and for the first time in months, the page began to fill. It was only when she stopped, breathless, and read it back that she realized the mysterious, brooding businessman looked suspiciously like her wall-sharing neighbor. The next week settled into a tense, unspoken rhythm. Mornings were for writing, or at least for trying. Elara would sit at her desk, fueled by strong coffee and a simmering resentment toward Cassian, and churn out pages. They were angrier, sharper pages than her usual work, her heroine's internal monologue laced with a cynicism that felt both foreign and thrilling. She found herself questioning her own tropes. Would a man really give up his multinational corporation for love? Cassian's voice, dripping with sarcasm, seemed to echo in her head. Doubtful. Their interactions were limited to brief, bristling encounters. She'd be chopping wood badly for her fireplace, and he'd emerge to get something from his truck. Careful you don't romanticize that axe swing, he'd comment dryly before driving off. She'd be sitting on her porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the stars, and he'd be on his, smoking a cigarette, the glowing tip a tiny beacon of his presence. They never spoke during these moments, but the silence was a conversation in itself, a standoff between two different worldviews. One afternoon, a fierce mountain storm rolled in, howling around the cabins and plunging the world into a premature twilight. The power flickered once, twice, and then died with a final sounding sigh. Perfect, Elara muttered, fumbling in the darkness for candles. She found a few, their soft, dancing light doing little to push back the oppressive dark. The wind screamed like a banshee, and the cabin groaned in protest. She tried to read, but her mind kept wandering to frozen pipes and marauding bears, all the irrational fears the darkness conjures. Then she heard it, a low, rhythmic thumping from the other side of the wall. Thump, thump, thump. It was deliberate, persistent. Irritated, she went to the wall and knocked back. What? The thumping stopped. A moment later, there was a knock at her front door. Startled, she peered through the peephole. Cassian stood there, a hurricane lamp in his hand, his face illuminated from below, casting dramatic shadows across his features. He looked like a character from one of his own mysteries, the enigmatic stranger arriving in a storm. Cautiously, she opened the door a crack. What is it? You have a fireplace that actually works? He asked, his voice raised over the wind. Yes. Good. So do I. But I'm out of dry wood. You have a stack under your overhang. I have whiskey. It's a simple transaction. We can freeze in cynical solitude, or we can temporarily form a survival pact. Your choice. Elara hesitated. The idea of spending the storm alone in the dark was suddenly far less appealing than the idea of sharing a room with her infuriating neighbor. At least he was a living, breathing human who wasn't currently a figment of her struggling imagination. Fine, she said, stepping back. Transaction. He entered, bringing with him a gust of cold air and the scent of damp wool and sandalwood. He set the lamp on the table and placed a bottle of very expensive-looking single malt scotch beside it. He surveyed her cabin, his gaze taking in the cozy blankets, the vase of wildflowers she'd picked days ago, the copy of her latest book, A Heart's Unyielding Compass, sitting on the coffee table. His eyes lingered on the cover, which featured a man and woman locked in a passionate, windswept embrace. Light reading? He asked. Research, she retorted, moving to the fireplace. She knelt and began to arrange the kindling, her hands trembling slightly, though she wasn't sure if it was from the cold or his presence. Here, let me, he said, his voice closer than she expected. He knelt beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. He took the wood from her hands, his fingers deft and sure. You're building a funeral pyre for a small rodent, not a fire. In moments, he had a small, bright blaze going, the flames licking hungrily at the logs. They sat on the floor, their backs against the sofa, watching the fire grow. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey into the glasses he'd brought and handed one to her. The amber liquid burned a welcome path down her throat, spreading warmth through her chilled body. The great Cassian, brought low by a lack of firewood, she said, unable to resist the jab. Even misanthropes prefer not to become human popsicles, he replied, staring into the flames. Besides, I was curious. About what? About the inner sanctum, the place where the magic happens, or, in your case, where the unrealistic fantasies are manufactured. Elara took a larger sip of whiskey. You know, for someone who claims to hate romance, you have a real obsession with it. I don't hate romance, he corrected, turning his stormy eyes on her. I hate the lie of it, the simplification. You sell people a fairy tale that sets them up for failure. Real relationships are messy, complicated, and often end not with a grand gesture, but with a slow, quiet fizzle. Or with a knife in the back. Is that what happened to you? The question was out before she could stop it, fueled by the whiskey and the strange intimacy of the storm. He was silent for a long moment, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the moan of the wind. My last book, he said finally, not looking at her. The research. I was embedded with a homicide unit. You see things, the darkest corners of people's lives. The things they do to each other for money, for pride, for what they call love. It makes the notion of happily ever after seem not just naive, but insulting to the victims. Elara looked at his profile, the tight set of his jaw, the shadows the firelight carved under his cheekbones. She saw it then, not just cynicism but a deep, weary pain, a disillusionment that was bone deep. My books aren't a lie, she said softly, surprising herself with her own defensiveness. They're a hope, promise. In a world that can be ugly and cruel and random, people need to believe that connection is possible. That there's a pattern, a reason, a person who makes sense of the chaos. That's not a fantasy, Cassian. That's a fundamental human need. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time there was no mockery in his gaze. There was only a quiet, intense scrutiny that made her breath catch. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. You really believe that, don't you? He murmured. I have to, she whispered. Or what's the point? They sat in silence for a long time after that, passing the whiskey bottle back and forth, listening to the storm rage itself out. The initial tension had evaporated, replaced by a tentative, fragile understanding. He was a man who had seen too much darkness to believe in the light. She was a woman whose entire career depended on convincing people the light was real. When the power finally surged back on, flooding the cabin with electric light, the moment was broken. Cassian blinked and stood up, the shuttered, cynical expression returning to his face as if it were a familiar coat. Storm's passing, he said, his voice back to its usual flat tone. He collected his lamp and the now half-empty bottle. Thanks for the wood. Thanks for the whiskey, Elara said, standing as well. He paused at the door. For what it's worth, he said without turning around, your fire-building skills are atrocious. A small, unexpected smile touched her lips. And your taste in music is criminal. He gave a short, sharp nod, almost a salute, and then he was gone, swallowed by the now quiet night. Elara turned back to her laptop. The blank screen no longer seemed like a taunt, but a challenge. She sat down and began to write, not about a perfect, brooding hero, but about a complicated, wounded man who had forgotten how to believe in hope, and the woman who was stubborn enough to remind him. The words came easier than they had in a year. The storm had changed something. A fragile truce had been declared, built on the shared foundation of whiskey and weathered fear. The following days saw a shift in their dynamic. The barbs were still there, but they had lost their sharp, cutting edge, becoming more like the familiar, teasing banter of old acquaintances. Elara found her writing flowing with a new vitality. Her hero, once a cardboard cutout of a romantic lead, was becoming more complex, more real. He had a cynical wit, a hidden vulnerability, and a past that haunted him. She didn't admit to herself that he was beginning to sound, look, and think disturbingly like Cassian. One evening, she was wrestling with a crucial scene where her heroine had to confront the hero about his emotional withdrawal. The dialogue felt flat, cliched. Frustrated, she did something impulsive. She marched over to Cassian's cabin and knocked. He opened the door, looking tired but alert. His cabin was the mirror image of hers, but where hers was cozy and slightly cluttered with her things, his was starkly minimalist. The dominant feature was a massive desk piled high with books, notepads, and a vintage typewriter. Maps of fictional towns were pinned to the walls, connected by a web of red string. It looked less like a writer's study and more like a detective's incident room. "Truce over?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "No," she said, holding up her printed pages. "I need a professional opinion." One dark eyebrow arched. "On a romance novel? On human nature? You're the expert on the dark, messy parts, right? This scene, it's not working. It's too clean, too polite. How would a man who builds walls for a living actually react when someone tries to knock them down?" Cassian studied her for a moment, then stepped back, silently inviting her in. It felt like crossing a border into enemy territory. He took the pages from her, his fingers brushing against hers, and sat at his desk, gesturing for her to take the chair opposite. He read in silence, his expression unreadable. Elara fidgeted, feeling exposed. Finally, he looked up. "It's terrible." She flinched. "Well, you don't have to." He wouldn't give a long, eloquent speech about his tortured past. Cassian interrupted, tapping the page. He'd deflect. He'd get angry. He'd say something cruel and cutting, designed to push her away, because that's easier than being vulnerable. The emotion wouldn't be in the words he says. It would be in the ones he doesn't. In the way he clenches his fist, or the way he can't quite meet her eyes. The truth is in the subtext, Elara, not the text. He stood up and paced, a caged panther of creative energy. "Look, your character, this Grayson, he's seen things, right? He's been betrayed. He doesn't believe anyone could love the damaged parts of him. So when she gets close, his instinct isn't to confess. It's to attack, to prove her wrong before she can figure it out for herself and leave. It's a preemptive strike." Elara stared at him, her mind reeling. It was a brutal, brilliant analysis. It was exactly what was missing. "A preemptive strike," she repeated slowly. "Exactly. He's not trying to hurt her. He's trying to save himself. It's selfish, it's ugly, but it's human." He stopped pacing and looked at her. "That's the truth you're missing. You're writing the pretty version." "I'm writing the hopeful version," she countered, but her heart wasn't in it. He was right. "Hope that isn't earned isn't hope. It's delusion," he said softly. "Make him earn it. Make her fight for it. Make it messy." Inspired, she went back to her cabin and rewrote the scene. She let her hero be cruel. She let him say things he didn't mean. She let her heroine cry. Not delicate, pretty tears, but angry, frustrated sobs. And in the end, she had him not sweep her into his arms, but simply stand there, shattered by the wreckage of his own defenses, unable to take a single step toward her. It was the most powerful, real thing she had ever written. The next day, she printed the new version and left it on his porch with a note. "Is this messy enough for you?" An hour later, a single sheet of paper was slid under her door. On it, he had typed just 2 words, "Getting closer." A strange, new ritual began. She would leave pages for him. He would return them with terse, insightful notes. People don't monologue their feelings. They hide them. Or the setting is a character. Use the storm, the cold, the isolation. His critiques were never gentle, but they were always right. He was chiseling away the artifice of her writing, forcing her to find the raw, emotional core beneath. In return, she started reading one of his books, A Shroud of Lies. It was dark, complex, and beautifully written. The prose was as sharp and cold as a scalpel. But as she read, she began to see something else hidden between the lines of violence and betrayal. A profound, aching loneliness. A yearning for a world that made sense. For a truth that wasn't ugly. His characters weren't just solving crimes. They were searching for order in the chaos, for a single thread of decency in a corrupt tapestry. It was, in its own twisted way, a search for love. She mentioned this to him one afternoon as they shared a pot of coffee on her porch, the mountain air crisp and clean. "Your book," she said carefully. "The detective, Sultan, he's not just cynical. He's heartbroken. The whole world is his ex-lover who betrayed him." Cassian went very still. "That's a romantic interpretation." "Is it?" He keeps going back to that little Italian restaurant, the one that's always empty. He doesn't even like the food. He goes because the owner, the old man, always remembers his name. It's the one place where he's not just a cop, he's a person. That's not a mystery trope, Cassian. That's a love story. It's just a quiet, sad one. He looked out at the mountains, his jaw tight. He didn't confirm or deny it. He simply sat in the silence she had held for him, a silence that was no longer a battleground, but a shared space. The turning point came 3 weeks into her stay. Elara had broken through her block completely. The novel was pouring out of her, richer, deeper, and more authentic than anything she'd ever written. She was in the final act, the emotional climax where her hero and heroine had to choose each other, not in spite of their flaws, but because of them. She was so absorbed she didn't notice the car pulling up outside until she heard the voices. A woman's voice, bright and shrill, and Cassian's, low and tense. Curious, she peered out the window. A sleek, expensive sports car was parked next to his truck. A beautiful, sharp-faced woman in a designer coat was standing on his porch, gesticulating angrily. Elara couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Accusation, bitterness, regret. It was the research, the ex-lover, the knife in the back. Elara knew it with a sudden, fierce certainty. She watched, hidden behind her curtain, as the argument escalated. The woman finally threw her hands up in despair, got back in her car and sped away, spraying gravel. Cassian stood on his porch for a long time, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. He looked utterly defeated. Elara's heart ached for him. The cynical, armored man was gone, leaving behind a raw, wounded human being. Without overthinking it, she filled a thermos with the hot chocolate she'd been making herself, the kind with little marshmallows, the antithesis of his single malt scotch, and walked over. He didn't hear her approach. She stopped at the bottom of his porch steps. Cassian? He looked up, and the pain in his eyes was so stark it stole her breath. For a moment, he looked like he might tell her to leave, rebuild his walls right there and then. But he didn't. He just sighed, a long, weary exhalation. The truth of human nature, he said, his voice rough. Can I come up? She asked softly. He nodded. She sat beside him on the top step, their shoulders not touching, but close enough to feel the heat from his body. She handed him the thermos. It's hot chocolate.
No whiskey, I'm afraid.
A ghost of a smile touched his lips. He unscrewed the cap and took a sip. Sweet, he commented. Sometimes things are, she said. They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the sun begin to dip behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. That was Lena, he said finally, the name dropping into the quiet like a stone. The reason I believe in preemptive strikes. We were together for 5 years. I was researching my last book, spending all my time with the cops, the criminals, the victims. I was drowning in the darkness, and I didn't even realize I was pulling her under with me. She had an affair with my editor, said I was already married to the ghosts in my stories, that I had nothing real left to give her. Elara said nothing. She just listened, her presence a quiet anchor. I thought my work was about truth, he continued, staring at his hands. But I was just hiding in it, using other people's tragedies as a shield so I wouldn't have to face my own emptiness, my own fear of this. He gestured vaguely between the two of them, of something simple and quiet and sweet. He looked at her then, and the storm in his eyes had quieted into something else, something vulnerable and terrifyingly open. You were right, Elara, about my book, about Sultan. He's looking for the one thing that doesn't fit, the one clue that makes sense of the chaos. I think I was too. Elara's breath caught. The air between them was charged, thick with everything they had never said. The shared looks, the late-night critiques, the easy silences, the defiant, growing attraction they had both been pretending was just intellectual friction. Cassian, she whispered. Your books, he said, his voice low and intense. They're not a lie. They're a map. A map to a place I stopped believing I could ever find. You! He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, sending a jolt through her entire system. You are the most infuriatingly, stubbornly optimistic person I have ever met, and you've somehow rebuilt my faith in the unrealistic. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, but she didn't. She moved forward, closing the small, impossible distance between their worlds. The kiss was nothing like the ones she wrote about in her books. It wasn't a dramatic, earth-shattering event accompanied by soaring music. It was quieter than that, deeper. It was a question and an answer, a surrender and a victory. It tasted of hot chocolate and regret and a wild, fragile, burgeoning hope. It was the first completely, terrifyingly real thing that had ever happened to her, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that no fictional romance would ever compare. When they finally broke apart, the world had shifted on its axis. The pine trees seemed sharper, the colors of the sunset more vivid. Cassian rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "Well?" he breathed, a genuine, unguarded smile finally gracing his features. "That was a hell of a plot twist." Elara laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that echoed in the quiet evening. Chapter 24 is going to need a serious rewrite. The final week of her rental passed in a blur. The cabin in the woods was no longer a solitary prison but a secret world they had built for themselves. Elara wrote during the day, her words now infused with a new, profound understanding of love's complexities. Cassian edited, the grimness of his prose softening at the edges, allowing for glimpses of the light he was rediscovering. They talked for hours, about everything and nothing, about their childhood dreams, their worst fears, their favorite books. They argued about the merits of chocolate versus vanilla ice cream and made up with a passion that left them both breathless. They hiked through the woods, his hand firmly holding hers, and he pointed out things she would have missed. The track of a fox in the snow, the way the light filtered through the canopy, the name of a specific type of moss. He showed her the world through his eyes, and she found it more beautiful and more detailed than any setting she had ever imagined. One evening, they were in her cabin, a fire roaring in the hearth. Elara's laptop was closed, the first draft of her novel finally, triumphantly, complete. It was a better book than any she had written before, and she knew it. It was their book in a way. "I have to go back to the city tomorrow," she said, the words feeling heavy in her mouth. "I know," Cassian said. His arm wrapped around her shoulders as they sat on the rug. "My lease here is up, and I have a manuscript to deliver to a very anxious publisher. And I have a deadline for a book that, thanks to you, now has a strangely hopeful ending," he admitted. They were silent, the unspoken question hanging in the air between them. What happened when they left the mountains? What happened when the fantasy of the remote cabin collided with the reality of their separate lives, their separate careers? "I'm not good at this part," Cassian said quietly, his fingers tracing patterns on her arm. "The part after the first kiss. I tend to write my way out of it." "This isn't one of your mysteries, Cassian," Elara said, turning to face him. "You don't have to solve it. We just have to live it. Messily, complicatedly, realistically." He cupped her face in his hands, his gray eyes serious. "I don't do promises well, but I can do this one. I promise to try, to be messy with you." It was enough. It was more than enough. The next morning, they packed their cars side by side. The easy intimacy of the past week was tinged with the bittersweet ache of departure. He walked over to her as she was loading the last of her bags. "Here," he said, handing her a thick manila envelope. "Don't open it until you're on the road." She took it, her fingers brushing against his. "Is this your version of a love letter? A critique of my packing skills?" "Something like that," he said, a small, private smile on his face. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, lingering kiss that held the promise of 1,000 more. Drive safe, Elara Vance. You too, Cassian Thorne. She got in her car and drove away, watching his tall, solitary figure grow smaller in her rearview mirror until he was gone. When she was an hour down the mountain, she pulled over at a scenic overlook, her hands trembling. She opened the envelope. Inside was the manuscript of his new novel, A Quiet Truth. Paper-clipped to the title page was a note in his sharp, slanted handwriting. Elara, you asked for the truth. Here it is. The story of a man who thought he knew everything about darkness, until a woman with a laptop and a hopelessly optimistic heart rented the cabin next door and taught him how to see the light. It's messy, it's complicated, and it's the most realistic thing I've ever written. It's yours if you want it. See. Tears streamed down Elara's face, but they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She looked out at the vast, beautiful, unpredictable landscape before her, and she knew with every fiber of her being that her own story was just beginning. It wouldn't be a perfect, seamless fairy tale. There would be arguments and insecurities and deadlines that pulled them apart. But there would also be shared laughter, quiet understanding, and a love that was earned, fought for, and real. It was the best plot twist of all. 6 months later, the book launch was held in a packed, buzzing independent bookstore. Elara stood at the podium, a copy of her new novel, The Cynic's Redemption, in her hands. The crowd was a mix of her usual romance readers and a new, intriguing contingent of mystery fans. And so, this book was born in a place of silence and frustration. Elara was saying, her voice clear and confident, but it was finished in a place of noise and debate, and, well, a lot of very loud, very bad thrash metal. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. Her eyes found his, standing at the back of the room, leaning against a bookshelf, his arms crossed. He was wearing a suit, and he looked unbearably handsome and slightly uncomfortable. He winked at her. She continued, "It's a story about finding love in the most unexpected place, right next door. And it's about learning that the most realistic love of all isn't the one that's perfect, but the one that's true. Thank you all for coming." The applause was thunderous. As she signed books, person after person told her it was her best work yet, that it felt so real, so raw. Later, when the last fan had gone and the store was closing, Cassian walked up to her. On the table next to her was a stack of his own new book, A Quiet Truth, which had been released to critical acclaim the week before. The cover was stark and elegant, a single keyhole with a sliver of light shining through. "You were brilliant," he said, pulling her into his arms. "Says the best-selling author who just got a starred review from the New York Times," she teased, leaning into his embrace. "It's our second act," he murmured into her hair. "So far, it's exceeding all my expectations. And it's completely unrealistic," she whispered, tilting her face up to his. "Thank God," he said, and kissed her.